Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. At a time when our country is having a national dialogue about how we honor historical figures, right here in the Borderland, there is a debate on how to honor Don Juan de Oñate. In recent months, there have been protests in New Mexico to remove his name from buildings as well as statues honoring him. This summer, violence broke out at a protest to remove a statue of Onyate in Albuquerque, leaving one man hospitalized with a gunshot wound. Also this summer, the Las Cruces School Board voted to change the name of Onyate High School to Organ Mountain High School after calls to remove Onyate's name grew. Many critics hold Onyate responsible for overseeing the violent treatment of Native Americans. Joining us to offer some insight on the issue is Chicana historian and writer Dr. Yolanda Chávez Leyva, who has researched the protests of Onyate along the border. Dr. Leyva is an associate professor in history at the University of Texas at El Paso and also serves as the director of the Borderlands Public History Lab and the Institute of Oral History. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Leyva.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today.
It's great to have you. I was wondering if we could start off with getting an understanding of Onyate and who he was for our audience.
Of course, Juan de Oñate is a fascinating historical personage. He was the son of Cristobal de Oñate, who was not Spanish, he was Basque. And when he came to the Americas, he didn't even know Spanish. He became a very wealthy man as a result of mines in Zacatecas. So Juan de Oñate was born into a wealthy, privileged family who had made a huge amount of wealth off silver mines. He reached out to the Spanish government when they were looking for someone to settle what was called back then Nuevo Mexico, and he received the contract. Sometimes people don't know why New Mexico is called New Mexico or Nuevo Mexico, and it has to do with this hope, this desire that the Spanish crown had in the 1500s, that they would discover another place like Central Mexico. Central Mexico was called Mexico. Of course, there was no nation of Mexico at that time, and they found a very large population, very well organized, very productive in agriculture and other industries. And their hope was to find a new place with those characteristics. So they wanted someone to go settle what they hoped would be a Nuevo Mexico, a new Mexico. And Onyate got the contract.
Now, Onyate brought several hundred people with him on his expedition north to New Mexico. Can you kind of share with us the impact he had immediately on our region?
Sure, he did bring several hundred soldiers, also families, indigenous people from Central Mexico came. One of the things that surprises people very often is that there were more Africans in colonial Mexico than there were Spaniards.
Wow.
So there weren't too many Spaniards back then. And as I'm saying, he was the son of someone who was Basque. So he brought several hundred people with him. It was a very, very difficult journey. They were going through desert. They were going through very arid land without water. His chronicler said that when they got to the Rio Grande, actually here in the El Paso area, the horses were so thirsty that they threw themselves into the river and they drank the water so fast that their stomachs burst. And that was the horses. So imagine the people too who were so thirsty and so hot. We know how hot it is in our region.
Yeah.
So imagine walking it or imagine riding a horse. It was very difficult. So he came through the El Paso region into what is now New Mexico and began to encounter indigenous people. The first indigenous people he encountered were actually here in El Paso, and the Spanish call them the mansos, the docile ones. We don't really know what they call themselves, but they weren't docile, they were friendly. They were friendly and generous. And that's really what Onyate found all along the way was native people who were willing to help, but he usually pushed it to beyond their limits of helping.
Could you kind of explain how he pushed those limits?
Sure. Imagine 200 or 300 people traveling from Zacatecas and going into what is now New Mexico. They're not able to carry all the supplies that they need for that length of time. So one of the things that Onyate did was ask for, especially food, from every indigenous pueblo that he encountered. And we know right now the pueblos in New Mexico, well, there were many more pueblos when Onyate came, many more, and some were destroyed by Spanish attacks and joined with other pueblos. Some remained, like the Acoma, who were the target of a lot of his violence. So he was asking for food. And if you can imagine, when he went to Acoma Pueblo, one of the main sources of food, one of the staples of food was ground corn. And I don't know if anyone in the audience has ever tried to use a grinding stone, the metate. I have, and it's really hard. So women were spending maybe 8 hours a day grinding corn for families for the day. So he went in and he asked for ground corn and he wanted it now. That's almost impossible because it's very time consuming. And things like that angered him that people couldn't provide the food as quickly as he wanted it. And it was unreasonable to ask for food immediately. And to come in as a stranger, to come in from another culture and demand these things that people who've been living like the Acoma on their land for thousands of years, of course they were going to respond. So when we go towards Santa Fe and we go through Socorro, New Mexico, we know that Socorro in Spanish means help or assistance. So he called it that because that was one of the pueblos where he got help.
Now, Onyate today is criticized for his treatment of indigenous people in our region. Could you share with us a little bit more about how brutal of a treatment he delivered to indigenous people in the area?
Sure. One of the battles that he waged against indigenous people was at Acoma Pueblo that I've mentioned a little bit now. Fighting broke out between his troops and the people of Acoma. His nephew was killed, and that enraged him. So he ordered a very harsh punishment of having 1 foot cut off of every male in the pueblo from age 12 on up. And some historians say it was never carried out. And I hope that's the case, but I don't believe that's the case.
Now,
The women, meanwhile, were basically kidnapped and sent to central Mexico to work as domestic workers and to work in mills, for example. So it was a very harsh punishment that he waged against the Acoma people, really for defending their homes. So he's considered very cruel by today's standards. One of the things that people always say is, well, that's just how it was back then. People were cruel back then. But the Spanish government charged him with excessive cruelty back then. And they also charged him with being a very inadequate manager of New Mexico. So he was not good to the people that settled New Mexico, coming from other parts of Mexico, and he was very cruel to indigenous people. And the Spanish government knew it and charged him, took him out of his post, and he was fighting to regain his good reputation for many years after that.
Dr. Leyva, why was Onyate so revered if the Spanish government reprimanded him for his actions in our region?
The kind of commemoration that we see of Onyate, whether it be buildings and schools named after him or statues placed to honor him, is something more contemporary. He was not revered in his time period at all.
So it has more to do with the way that history was perhaps taught in schools maybe 100 years ago?
Right, so it has to do with the way that history was written 100 years ago, where historians were talking about Spanish conquistadores bringing culture to the area, and also the desire to bring tourists to New Mexico. And that goes back to the 1880s, 1890s. So one of the pulls was look at the wonderful past that we had in the conquistadores. So it's a much more modern idea to honor him.
Now, we've seen protests of the statues of Onyate across our region. Can you give us a history of when this started in our area?
There have been protests against the statues of Onyate in New Mexico and even here in El Paso, going back to the 1980s, 1990s, when people began to raise this awareness of he was a very cruel person, why do we want to honor him? And if you think of a statue that's on a pedestal, and if you think of how we talk about putting people on a pedestal, it's a positive thing. That means that we admire them, that we honor them. So people begin to say, why would we honor him of all people? So the statues are not about teaching history. They're about reflecting who we honor really as a hero. And that's where the protests came in. Sometimes people say, you're erasing history if you take down that statue of Onyate. But we're not erasing history, because if you have a statue, what history do you learn from a statue? You only know it's someone that we honor.
You've done extensive research on this issue of protesting Onyate in the Borderland region. When did things really become more vocal in our area in regards to perhaps taking down the statues or changing the names of institutions or buildings where Onyate's name is? I mean, when did this really start to gain more traction in our region?
There was a lot of movement to remove statues in the 1990s, and then it seemed to become more quiet. There was, again, in the early 2000s, people were talking about removing statues, but it's really been in the past few months that I see it as more widespread, as having more support. People who before maybe didn't think about it that much are suddenly saying, yeah, we should take away the name Onyate, or we should take down that statue of Onyate. And I think it has to do with the context of Black Lives Matter. It has to do with the context of people questioning everything about race and power right now. So this is an amazing time to see what is happening with statues in general and with Onyate in particular.
So where do you think we go from here in this moment with the dialogue that's happening across our country on these issues? Where do you think this is going?
So it really heartens me a lot that we're having these kinds of discussions and debates, not the violence. You know, if we could have the discussions and the debates without the violence. But it really shows you how important the representation of history is to people. If we could have those debates and start to question, why do we have statues? Why do we have memorials to people? And what does it represent to us? I think if we really thought about it, most of the statues in the United States would be gone. The Confederate statues, the conquistador statues, because that's not who I believe we think of ourselves as a nation. We don't think, even though we've had a very traumatic, difficult past, and we've done many things to various groups of people that are tragedies, but we don't think of ourselves as a nation that strives to be cruel or a nation that strives for inequality. So more discussion, and I personally would be fine if we took down all the statues. And if they had some kind of context, if they got put in a museum, if it was explained when the statue was put up and why, I think people would learn a lot more.
Yeah, that's the thing I kind of wanted to move on to next was how do we do that but still keep the history so people know exactly what really happened here in our region?
Yeah, that's why I think putting the context with the statue would be important, because people don't know the history, and people don't necessarily know the history of the statue itself. Confederate statues started to go up in the 20s when the Ku Klux Klan reemerged. They went up again in the 60s as a response to the civil rights movement. The conquistador statues go up often to draw tourists. And I think if people knew that, that would teach them more about history than just a statue somewhere.
I'd like to talk with you about some other work that you do in the community with the Borderlands Public History Lab. Can you share with us the work that you do there and what the lab is all about?
Sure. We decided to call it a lab because it was a place where we could combine different things and come up with new ideas. So it's a combination of the Institute of Oral History that's been around since 1972 and Museo Urbano that's been around since 2009. The Institute of Oral History gathers the stories of people in the borderlands related to big historic events like World War II or their day to day lives. All of it is important to document. So we have about 2,000 oral histories. Museo Urbano is a museum of the streets that highlights the history of the borderlands. And they are able to feed into each other quite a bit. So if we do an exhibit about a neighborhood on the south side of El Paso, we also do oral history so we can back it up. So the history becomes more human. And the whole thing is to gather the stories of the borderlands from the perspective of people who live on the borderlands.
The Borderlands is such a unique place
Mm-hmm.
here in our region. I mean, we have 3 states, 2 countries connecting each other, and also a rich history of different cultures coming together to live in one area. But this time in particular, especially in El Paso, is like something so unique because you have this focus on a border wall at the national level with immigration policy from the Trump administration, but you also have something happening in El Paso where there is this movement to redevelop the downtown and change that area to try to grow the economy. Can you kind of give us an understanding of what exactly is really happening in the community right now during this time with all these things happening?
Right, there is a lot happening. The efforts to revitalize the downtown are very controversial, in part because the plan that was approved back in 2007 includes the demolition of one of the most historic Mexican immigrant neighborhoods, at Segundo Barrio, and the demolition of another neighborhood, Duranguito, in order to build an arena. So it would be one thing if we were talking about actually revitalizing downtown versus demolishing neighborhoods and displacing people in order to, again, bring in tourists. New Mexico and Texas always want to bring in tourists, and the plans are not always very good for regular people. And then, of course, the wall. We've had the border fence. since the Bush administration. And now we have right there at Sunland Park, New Mexico, that fence that was built with private funds. It's been in the news recently because of Bannon being arrested. So we're surrounded by this idea of dividing people, separating people, when what we know is that our tri-state area, El Paso, Las Cruces, Juarez, we have been welcoming of people, for, since the beginning.
So with these actions taking place right now, and how does it impact the work you're doing? Does it feel like there's more of a race to capture all of the voices in the community who may be impacted by this change happening in the area?
It does feel like it's a race to capture the stories. Before things got very heated, I was doing a lot of interviews with men who had come to the United States as temporary workers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I was interviewing a lot of 90-year-olds.
Wow.
And so they were able to look back on their lives and see what worked, what was difficult. And the way I felt back then was like, they're 90 years old. I have to interview them quickly.
Yeah.
And now everything seems like a race because this is such an amazing time, and not always a good time, but it's, a historic time. And I'm just afraid that if we don't document it, a lot of voices will be lost.
Now, trying to get those voices, the braceros and people who came to this area to work, some laid down roots, many did, and there's generations have passed since then. Many folks in our community can go back a couple generations, and that was their great grandparents or their grandparents. So there's so much that we might lose with all of this change that's happening in our region. So can you kind of give us an idea of what we can do to help sustain these stories and this history?
You're right that so many people in our region are descended from braceros. And I've met younger people, my students at the university, who didn't even know that their grandfather was a bracero. So what I would suggest and what I would really urge people to do is to record your own family histories, to record the histories, if you don't have a family, of your community. And people will say, I didn't do anything important, but tell them that their life was important and they're part of history. So use your phone, buy a digital recorder, save those stories. And if you want to share them with us, we'll definitely look at them.
It's really an amazing experience what you're talking about. I was able to do this a couple years ago with my grandfather, who turned 98 just this month. And at Thanksgiving, being able to talk with him and learn about his history, and it was really a powerful moment and something that we'll always be able to have and learn from. And so I was wondering, you mentioned you can use a smartphone. Can people get in touch with you in the area to learn how we could capture these voices? And is there a movement to keep them all collected?
Sure, definitely. People can contact me because we're working remotely right now. The best way to reach me is via email. It's YLEYVA, so Yleyva at utep.edu. And I'm happy to talk to people. I do workshops in the community teaching people how to do oral histories. I'm happy to do them remotely for now and in person in the future. I think, like you said, it's a powerful experience that you were able to interview your grandfather. And it's a real gift that you have given your family by taking the time to do that.
Well, we want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us on the program, Dr. Yolanda Chávez Leyva. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing so much.
Thank you so much.
And we want to thank you for joining us for Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.